Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the injured/added players for the San Jose Sharks this season and reviewing their performances on the year. This is the third and final in a set of videos. The first one, I discussed the Sharks prospects who had not played a game with the San Jose Sharks this season. In the second video, I discussed their rookies who played a small handful of games for the Sharks this year. And in this one, I will be discussing the players who didn't really play enough to deserve a full-scale review in their own specific videos, but played enough games for them to have an impact on the Sharks season as a whole, and so I will be discussing a few of them here. Like with the rookie update, this is not an exhaustive list of every other player. For instance, there's no Andreas Johnson, there's no Martin Kaut on this list, but the players who I am going to be discussing are players who more so caught my eye, either in that having a larger impact with the San Jose Sharks, or players who could potentially have a future impact with the team. So let us start off with a couple of the injured players for the San Jose Sharks, and at the top of this list we have Luke Kundan. Now, Mike Grier made a lot of changes this past offseason to bring in some new faces to the San Jose Sharks roster, and while some of them I didn't necessarily like at the time, I have sort of come around on a couple of them. For instance, I wasn't a big fan of the Matt Benning contract or even the Nico Sturm contract, but having watched their performances this past year, I've definitely come around. I liked Nico Sturm and thought he was deserving of the deal he got, and while Matt Benning's contract is still rather weird, it is pretty good value for the player that Matt Benning is, or at least was this past year. The player who I haven't come around on, however, is Luke Kundan, and the major reason for that is how he was acquired. At least with Matt Benning and Nico Sturm, had those deals not worked out, the Sharks would only be out money for a couple of years, but with Luke Kundan, they actually had to trade with the Nashville Predators to acquire him, and they gave away John Leonard, not necessarily a huge deal, but also a third-round pick. Now, a third-round pick is usually pretty much a shot in the dark, a pretty low chance at succeeding and ending up with an NHL player with that pick, but the problem here is that Luke Kundan is not particularly good, and in 2-3 years time, while he may very well be a part of the San Jose Sharks organization because it's very possible that Mike Grier likes him, I don't think he's going to be an actual important part, and that third round pick at least had a small opportunity of being something in this organization, so it still felt like a bit of a lost cause. But going on to how he actually played this year, Luke Kundan offensively was half decent. 31 games played, 5 goals, 8 assists for 13 points. Over a full 82-game season, that's around 30 to 35 points, which is certainly not bad for a third liner, though it should be noted that Luke Kundan had about 15 and a half minutes of ice time on average for this season, or at least for the 31 games he played, and that frequently included trips into the top 6 for the San Jose Sharks, and even a couple times on the top power play for the San Jose Sharks. So Kundan, you could have maybe expected a bit more offensively from him, but where he really struggled was on the defensive and just general fancy stat type of situation. Luke Kundan was a possession black hole for the San Jose Sharks. Out of the players who played at least 20 games, which is about a quarter of the season, Luke Kundan had the worst possession numbers on the entire team. So you could pretty much guarantee that when Luke Kundan was on the ice, the majority of the play was happening in the Sharks' defensive zone. He just wasn't particularly good at this role. And the thing is that he was not particularly good in this situation either when he was on the Nashville Predators last season. So this was a very known quantity when it comes to Luke Kundan, and yet they still ended up acquiring him. Maybe because of the sort of grit that he brings to the game, though I wouldn't necessarily say I noticed that a significant amount, and just generally I don't think he's necessarily all that great for the San Jose Sharks. But this was a season that indeed was cut short even before the halfway mark, so since he's on a 2-year deal and with 1 year left being next season, we shall see how he does in maybe a longer view, and maybe he can change my mind like a couple of those other additions did. Next we have Nikolai Kaneshov. Now, unlike Luke Kundan, who was brought in this past offseason, Kaneshov was already with the San Jose Sharks, but that doesn't mean that he actually played the previous year. In fact, he was injured for the entirety of that 21-22 season. He only made his NHL debut and played only a single season in the 2021 season. 56 games, mostly played at the side of Erik Karlsson. And in those 56 games, he was rather good, rather impressive for a young rookie defenseman. But unfortunately, like I said, he was injured for the entirety of the 21-22 season. And then even more unluckily, he got injured again in this past offseason, making it so that he missed a good half, if not more, of this this year, but he eventually did return. He got to play 12 games with the San Jose Sharks, scored a goal, got a point, no assists to speak of in those 12 games, but still at the very least he managed to get on the board. And here's the thing. If a veteran ends up being out for a year and a half due to injury, you're already expecting a downturn in terms of play, a sort of step back in terms of their performance. The fact that a rookie player like Kaneshov, who only had 56 games under his belt at the NHL level, got injured then for a year and a half, you're expecting likely an even greater step back. And so there is the sort of good news and bad news. The bad news being indeed there was a step back in terms of performance for Nikolai Kaneshov. But the good news is that I would say it maybe wasn't as much of a step back as expected. Kaneshov, I would say, was just maybe overcommitting to certain plays, putting himself very far out of position to try and chase after the puck, and as such maybe opening opportunities for the other team to be able to score. There were also just general defensive awareness issues with Nikolai Kaneshov at times this season, so that amounted to him not being particularly good and eventually getting actually sent back down to the Barracuda after a few looks with the NHL. But also good news, he did end up getting re-signed by the San Jose Sharks. Mike Grier giving him another couple of years to really show what he can do, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens come next season, because it's important to note, because of those injuries, that Kaneshov hasn't really gotten to participate in training camps or preseason for each of the past couple of years. So him getting that look, getting that ability to really prepare for a full NHL season could be really good for him. Moving on now to the actual mid-season additions, and first up we have Jacob MacDonald. Was part of that interesting trade that happened around the mid part of the year, where the Sharks traded Matt Nieto and Ryan Merkley to the Colorado Avalanche in exchange for Martin Kaut and, of course, Jacob MacDonald, a defenseman who immediately would be inserted into the lineup and actually find the favor, surprisingly, of David Quinn. Would at times get over 20 minutes for multiple games in the 25 that he played. Now, he was more so of an offensive defenseman in terms of play style, yet only 1 goal, 5 assists, and 6 points in the 25 games. And like I said, this is with playing second power play time. This is with him getting over 20 minutes per night. So over a full 82 game season, this is about 20 or so points on the year. So not necessarily all that great. But the interesting thing about Jacob MacDonald actually happens later on in the season. So frequently you will see, or maybe not frequently, but occasionally you will see teams run with an 11 forward, 7 defenseman setup. This is sometimes going to happen if a forward gets sort of injured out of nowhere, and so you end up just inserting a defenseman who is, particularly close to the lineup, or maybe you're just looking for a different setup. So you can run something like that, and the Sharks did exactly that with Jacob MacDonald a few times near the end of this season. But interestingly enough, usually when teams run that 11 forward, 7 defenseman, they actually play that 7th defenseman as a defenseman, and then they just sort of double shift top liners with the 2 fourth liners that they have. Instead here for the San Jose Sharks, Jacob MacDonald filled in an offensive role, played forward as a 4th line winger. And if this happened only a single time in this 25 game span, I wouldn't really think much of it. But the fact that this happened, I believe, 4 or 5 times, a fifth of the games that MacDonald played with the San Jose Sharks this season was him at forward, does make it a lot more notable, because going into next season, the San Jose Sharks still have all 6 of their top 6 defensemen under contract. So if we assume Erik Karlsson doesn't get traded, which is not necessarily an easy assumption to make, but let's just do it for the sake of this situation, that gives the Sharks 6 defensemen to play. But then there's also Kaneshov, there's also Shakir Muhammadulla, who could potentially make an impact. A player like Artemi Kniazev, you never know. And so it might be somewhat difficult for MacDonald to still manage to secure a top 6 defensive spot for the San Jose Sharks, especially since, at least in my opinion, his defensive play was rather spotty. On the offensive side of things, when he was a forward, he was actually quite good in that 4th line forward role, which is probably a major reason for why he was actually given multiple games in that particular position and not just a one and done type of situation. You see, with MacDonald being an offensive defenseman, he has that offensive instinct that allows him to transition more so to a forward. But one of the reasons why you don't just put an offensive defenseman at forward is because an offensive defenseman will usually possess, I would say, qualities where they're able to capitalize on the positions that they find themselves in as a defenseman. You know, it's not the reason why Erik Karlsson has played at defense is not because he's so good defensively and you really want him in that particular role, but it's more so in that the positions that he finds himself in because of his position as a defenseman allows him to really excel offensively. So for instance, he can go for those aggressive stretch passes. He can easily break out of the defensive zone with that first move and or with that first pass. When he finds himself at the blue line, he reads the offensive zone exceptionally well. How many times have we seen Erik Karlsson skate along the blue line and then take like a fake shot but actually pass to a player who's completely wide open and just completely fool the goaltender for the other team? It happens a lot. And so Erik Karlsson excels in that defensive position, but Jacob MacDonald never really had that. As an offensive defenseman, his major, I would say, advantage was he had an okay ability to read when to pinch in, but not even all that great, and his shot was also pretty decent. But in terms of actually reading the ice as a whole on a sort of 200-foot basis, not that great. But when you put him on the forward side of things, he still has the sort of defensive awareness to be a defensively responsible forward, but also some offensive capabilities to make them an effective forward. So generally, I feel as though that's the better position for him, but we'll see exactly what happens going into next season. I imagine he'll likely stay at the defensive side of things just because that's his natural role, but we will see. Next, we have Jacob Peterson, a very interesting pickup for the San Jose Sharks. 11 games played, 2 goals, 6 assists for 8 points. That is actually rather good. A very small sample size, so it's kind of unfair to project that out over a full 82 game season, but technically that's about, like 55 to 60 points over a full year. He was acquired at the trade deadline from the Dallas Stars in a sort of minor for minor league player trade. This happens frequently between teams. This is essentially a situation where both of these players had taken steps back this year with their respective organizations. Reedy had played almost half the season with the Sharks in the 21-22 season, but never managed to make the NHL this year. Jacob Peterson played over 3/4 of the season with the Dallas Stars last year and only played a single game with them this year, and so this was an opportunity to give them a change of scenery. And while Scott Reedy hasn't necessarily panned out with the Dallas Stars, that doesn't necessarily matter. What does matter is that Jacob Peterson has panned out with the San Jose Sharks. Once called up, actually was an extremely effective forward for them, and it is obviously reminiscent, I've made this comparison multiple times, reminiscent to Alexander Barabanov in the circumstances where he was brought to San Jose. Also a kind of similar situation, a minor league player for minor league player trade with the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Sharks gave away Antti Suomela and they got back Alex Barabanov, and Barabanov immediately made an impact with the Sharks, and then going into next season asserted himself as a solid top 6 player. Peterson in this year also immediately makes an impact, and we'll see exactly if he's able to follow a similar road and assert himself as a top 6 player. What is quite interesting about Jacob Peterson, there are some similarities with Barabanov's game. For instance, I think both of these players are quite good at playmaking, but where they slightly differ is that I would say Barabanov has a bit more sort of skill to his game in terms of stick handling, so he's potentially able to open those passing lanes a bit better than Peterson. But where I will give Peterson the edge is that I think Peterson has a bit better offensive awareness, and also I think he also has a slightly better shot. Again, these are things that are evaluated over a small sample size of just 11 games near the end of this pretty much hopeless season, so we'll definitely get a better look of the type of player Peterson is. It's possible he can pan out indeed like Barabanov does, but it's also possible he just falls off and doesn't necessarily make even the team for the San Jose Sharks. But it should be noted, going into next year, the Sharks only have 3 locked down top 6 forwards of Hertl, Couture, and Barabanov, and even in a world where, let's say, the Sharks win the draft lottery and get Connor Bedard to play in that top 6 next season, and they've also got William Eklund there, that still leaves an empty spot for potentially Jacob Peterson. So indeed, we shall see what happens, but definitely a very, very good early look for him as a new San Jose Sharks. We'll see exactly where his contract ends up at the end of this season, as he is a restricted free agent with arbitration rights. And then finally we have Fabian Zetterland, also picked up at around the trade deadline point, and this one in the huge Timo Meier deal. Now, when the Sharks were looking to trade Timo Meier, obviously the big things that you were hoping to get back were kind of future consideration, future players and prospects and picks for the San Jose Sharks. And so the players who immediately jumped, or the assets, I should say, that immediately jumped off the page once this massive deal was made was, of course, Shakir Muhammadulla, not necessarily the top prospect for the Devils, but a very good one, and now immediately one of the best prospects for the San Jose Sharks, as well as a first-round pick in this year's draft and a conditional first-round pick in next year's draft. Mind you, as a small sidebar here, these New Jersey Devils actually beat the New York Rangers in the first round of the playoffs this season, moving on to the second round against the Carolina Hurricanes. If they beat Carolina in that second round, that second-round pick in 2024 will become a first-round pick in 2024, so go Devils. But back to the major point, those are obviously the big assets that jumped off the page, but what Mike Grier was also targeting was a roster player in return, not necessarily one who would completely fill in the shoes for Timo Meier, but someone who could help fill that void. And I know a lot of Sharks fans were hoping to try and pick up a player like Dawson Mercer, a very young, very raw, but still very, very good NHL player from the New Jersey Devils, but instead they end up with the even more raw and even more inexperienced Fabian Zetterland, who was a rookie player, but had played about half the year with the New Jersey Devils up to that point and was putting up some pretty solid numbers. So Devils fans immediately were telling Sharks fans, oh, this is a very good player, he uses his body well, pretty big guy, solid shot, and he's a player who you're going to fall in love with from immediately the get-go, from game one that he actually plays with the San Jose Sharks. And so I was ready to enjoy and hopefully see what Zetterland was capable of, but through the 22 games played that he'd end up playing with just the 3 assists over that 22 game time span, I never really got anything even remotely interesting from Zetterland. Out of those 22 games, I would imagine about 3/4 of them he was more or less invisible, if not just quite bad, and only a small handful did he actually look in any sort of positive light. He does indeed have a sort of imposing presence in terms of him being a bigger guy on the ice, not necessarily the tallest, but maybe the bulkiest, you could say, but he doesn't even necessarily use that bulk to assert himself on the ice. His shot is decent, but honestly not that great, and he just doesn't really have the offensive and especially not the defensive awareness to seemingly succeed on the ice. Now, it should be noted, of course, that getting traded from a playoff team like the New Jersey Devils and then going to a team like the San Jose Sharks, who are obviously not going to make the playoffs, is sort of like a metaphorical slap to the face, where you're hoping to compete in a prestigious tournament, but instead you're just going to be golfing by the mid-April point. So it is definitely a tough transition, but for a rookie player who's looking to earn their first actual NHL contract in this upcoming offseason, you're likely expecting a better performance than this, and you didn't really get much from Fabian Zetterland. So definitely a pretty disappointing look thus far for him. We'll see if something like that can change going into the next season, but one thing is for sure, if the other pieces of this Timo Meier deal end up panning out like Zetterland has done thus far, it's going to be a pretty massive loss for the San Jose Sharks. But that will do it for this review. Basically, generally, when it comes to these injured and mid-season additions for the San Jose Sharks, there's some good, there's some average, and there's some relatively bad. But a lot of these players, like I've said, will be back with the San Jose Sharks next season, will be given the opportunity to play almost a full year with the San Jose Sharks, and so we'll definitely be able to then get a better look at how they do. Class dismissed.